Ishwaram, as resplendent sun. It's the start of a bright new day. Time to rise, time to shine, Lord divine. Time to lead us along life's way. Awake, Lord of Buddha party. Awake, O Lord, over all mankind. Awake, O Lord of compassion. Let the world go fortune.
Microphone. This is the mic?
Yeah, that's the mic.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. The first problem is, can you hear me? Yes. With clear at the back? Okay. Because you know what Swami says about you, don't you? He says that just as the ocean rises and surges up when there is a full moon in the sky, when I look at my devotees, my love for them overflows my heart. That is how Swami regards yourselves. And you may be sure that Swami is standing behind and beside every single person here. There isn't any doubt about it. I was telling Bill just a little while ago of the story about a small temple in India, and there was a yogi who was accustomed to sleeping in this temple. And a traveler came by at nighttime, needed a place to sleep, so he asked if he could sleep also in the temple. And the yogi said yes. And in the temple there was a statue of Krishna. And so at nighttime they both lay down, and in a few minutes the traveler opened his eyes and he saw the yogi sleeping with his feet pointed at Krishna. And that shocked him greatly. And he reprimanded the yogi. And the yogi said, "Oh, very well, very well." And so he moved, shifted to another position. And the pilgrim looked again, and there was Krishna at the yogi's feet. And again he reprimanded him. So the yogi turned the other way. And there again was Krishna at his feet. And so the traveler asked the yogi to explain. And the yogi said, "It is not possible to put one's feet any place on this earth and not have them pointing to Krishna." So Krishna, the Lord, is every place. Now, I was asked if I would start this session by telling two stories. One, how this Prema Sai ring came to be. This ring is the next incarnation, Prema Sai, not yet born. The father has been born according to Baba, but the mother has not been born yet. And Swami, some people think that Kasturi is going to be the mother. But I don't think Swami means that. Swami loves to joke and talk. And so he was always joking and poking fun at Kasturi. He would say, Kasturi, you're going to be the mother, you're going to be the mother. And so people would hear that, and they took it seriously. But I don't take it seriously, because I know from so long back how Swami loves to laugh and joke. In the very early days, when I was there, 25 years ago, and Swami would go on his trips in the car to Vrindavan, and then to Puttapati, and then to Anantapur, and so on. He would always take me in the car with him, and sitting in the back seat beside Swami, I would ride with the driver, and sitting in the back seat beside Swami would be two people. One was named Vittal Rao, and his daughter, I believe, is now the president of the girls' college at Anantapur. And Vittal Rao was a very, very funny man. He had tremendous wit, and he could always say things that would make Swami laugh. And Swami loves to laugh and joke. But at the same time, he had tremendous discrimination. He knew just exactly how far he could go and no further. So Swami kept him as a companion until he got too old. And then Swami said to him, well, Vittal Rao, do you want me to take you now or later? So what do you think Vittal Rao said? He said, please, Swami, later. Well, about the ring. Swami has given me, I think, 5 rings now, 6 now, with the diamond. He gave me a diamond a while ago. Because I'm a careless man, I move my hand without thinking, and I strike the ring against something. And you know, the customary ring that Swami gives is sort of an enamel ring with his picture on it. And so the last one he gave me of those, I broke it. And afraid to tell him that, I put it on a chain and put it under my shirt, thinking Swami will ask, Hislop, what's that bump under your shirt? But he didn't ask me that year, and it was towards the end of the next year that he finally said, Hislop, what's that bump under your shirt? So I pulled it out and said, well, Swami, I broke it. He said, let me have it. So I took it off and handed it to him. And he looked at it and said, oh, those stones are no good anyway. Then he threw it back to me. And then what he did was to just not say anything, but just put his hands like this and blow into his hands. And then there was a ring made, which he didn't show to me at all. He passed it all around the room to the college boys. This was in the old house, not the new house in Vrindavan. You all know that new house built like a lotus. The old house was left over from the British administration, sort of a big, rambling ranch house. It was nice because it had a big front porch. And those of us who were lucky enough to be living on the compound where Swami's house was, or devotees, old devotees who were able to come through the gate, we could go into that veranda first thing in the morning and sit there all day. Watch Swami come in and out, talk to him, he would say things to us, and so on. Of course, that's all finished now with the new house. Nobody can do that anymore. So at any rate, we were sitting in that house. And in that house, every evening, the bunch of the college boys would come. And they would sit in the veranda. And then Swami would call on them to give a speech without any preparation whatsoever. they had to get up and give a speech. And then he would call on individuals to sing bhajans, sort of a system of terrorizing people. And so I was eventually, I couldn't escape any longer. He pointed his finger at me one time and said, Hislop, you sing a bhajan. Well, I can't even carry a tune. But still, what could I do? Swami says to his devotee, sing a bhajan. So I opened my mouth and sang something. And from that arose a distinction that I think I don't share with anyone else. And that is, I'm the only person Swami never asked to sing twice. So it was at one of those meetings that Swami then made the ring, which he didn't show me, passed all around the boys. And then he finally gave it to me. And it was a big, solid gold ring with the Swami's bust, shoulders and head, sort of rising out of the gold. This big gold ring, then rising up was his bust and his head. Must have weighed, I think, 2 ounces. It was heavy, heavy as could be. So he finally gave it to me. So my wife and I were very pleased that night with the ring. And then in the morning, every morning we go there, not the ladies couldn't go, but the men did who were able to. And Swami in the morning would interview a bunch of the schoolboys. They would come up and form a line. And then he would talk to them. Sometimes he would scold them and sometimes joke with them if they had done something that wasn't right. He knew about it. He would just tell them right out and scold them severely. And so then he said to me, Hislop, give me the ring. I don't had it one night. And so I gave him the gold ring. So then he passed it all around amongst the boys and then came back and said, well, Hislop, would you like a picture of Swami on your ring or a picture of Shirdi Sai? What could I say? There's Swami standing right in front of me. You know, so I didn't answer at all. And so then Swami takes the ring and he goes around and shows it to all the boys again. And then he comes back to me and says, well, Hislop, what will it be? Shirdi Sai or Satya Sai? So fortunately, diplomacy came to my aid. And I said, Swami, you choose. So he said, well, you already have Satya Sai, so let it be Prema Sai. So then he took that very heavy gold ring and blew on it, and then Prema Sai ring came out. So that's the Prema Sai ring. It's the only likeness of Prema Sai that exists. There has been a picture passed around which is supposed to be a Prema Sai. I showed Swami a picture, a copy of the picture. And Swami said, no, just artist's fancy, not Prema Sai. So then the other story some people here asked me to tell before I started talking was the crucifix, because people asked to see the crucifix. But it's just a little thing, and it's very fragile. And I'm afraid to take it any place because it's so fragile. But at least let me tell you how that happened. You remember years ago how on Mahashivaratri, Swami would bring the lingam up out of some place within him, would come out of his mouth, eventually then be caught in a handkerchief. You know, he would be on the platform and the devotees in front of him, and then the bhajans would start, and Swami would sing the bhajans. Then you could see that something was happening, sort of uneasy, uncomfortable, and the bhajans would start to go faster and faster and faster and faster, and then suddenly Swami would go like that and put his hand out in a handkerchief, and out of his mouth would come this lingam. Big things. I was sitting very close to him one time, and out came this flash of light, and he had it in his hand, and it was a lingam on a platform, a little platform, with 3 legs. How in the world could that come up out of his throat and out of his mouth? I don't know. What one would see would be this flash of light. Whether this power and this light came out, then immediately formed into the lingam, I don't know what happened. But it went on for years. But then people got, there came to be too much publicity about it. And people in the background would start to walk around and disturb. And so then Swami said he wouldn't show the lingam anymore. He wouldn't do that anymore. So it came to an end. So then the next year on Mahashivaratri, Swami said to me, he said, Hislop, you get a taxi and you be ready at 5 o'clock in the morning. And you take Kasturi in your car. And we're going someplace. We're going up to, and Kasturi will know where it is. That's what he didn't tell me because he's afraid I would blab it to somebody. And Kasturi will know where it is. He'll tell you. And so we got in the car, and Kasturi said, well, keep on driving. We're going to go up to the Mysore forest. And as we went up to the Mysore forest, there was a constant procession of cars coming towards us, that is, people from all around coming to Vrindavan, hoping that the Mahashivaratri would be celebrated in Vrindavan. And you know, everybody knows Kasturi, but all the people in the cars coming knew Kasturi. They'd seen him for years. And yet not one of those cars recognized Kasturi riding in our taxi. Complete blank, complete disguise of some sort in front of them. They couldn't even see him. So we got up to the Mysore forest. And the first thing we did, there was some college students too. Swami had sent up a bus, maybe a dozen or so college students. And the first thing we did was to ride around through the forest trying to find the wild elephant herd. What we had hoped was we would have a repeat of what had happened some years before when Swami had taken a group of devotees to the Mysore forest. Maybe all you know that story, do you? No? Well, they drove around the forest, then they went into a clearing, and the car stopped. And Swami got out of the car and walked some distance in front of the car, and the devotees also got out and walked in front of the car. Swami went a little further away. Nobody follows him too closely. He stays some distance away from him. And so no sooner had that happened than there was a trumpeting at the edge of the forest. And a great big bull elephant stepped out of the forest, trumpeting. Well, the devotees all turned and rushed back to the car. And Swami looked at them and said, "What? You're going to leave Swami here all alone?" And then, out of the forest came this giant tusker right up toward Swami. He reached Swami, and down he goes on his knees and touches his head to Swami's feet. Then gets up and goes back into the forest, and the herd disappears. So we had hoped for a replay of that. But we couldn't find any elephants whatsoever. So then, driving around, Swami selected the place where Mahashivaratri would be celebrated, where he would do it. We saw a dry stream under a bridge, and Swami said, "We'll stop here. This is where we'll have it." So then we went back to the compound and came back about 6:30 for the Mahashivaratri ceremony. We got out of the car, walking down the bank to the dry river. And as we passed some bushes, Swami reached over and broke off just two little twigs. And he put them like that and said, "Well, what's that, Hislop?" So I said, "Well, it's a cross, Swami." So then he takes the two twigs and puts them in his hand like that and blew several really quite long, delayed breaths into his fists. Then he opened his hand and handed me the crucifix. Well, I didn't know what to say. And I noticed a hole at the top of the crucifix. And so I said, "Well, Swami, what's that hole?" And Swami said, well, the cross was hung on a peg. It's not as history says. The cross was hung on a peg, and it was through this hole that was pegged to a post. So then we went on down to the river bottom, and we found that as we were sitting on the sand, we were sitting on bones, human bones. And we found it was a place where they burned bodies. And the people said, well, this is quite appropriate for Shiva. I didn't know what they meant when they said that, but later on I learned that that is part of the Indian tradition. And so we sat there. Then Swami sang some bhajans, and he then brought out the lingam and passed around and showed it to every one of us and put it on the table in front of him. And then he reached up and pulled out a vase out of the air, which was filled with amrit. And then he reached up and pulled a spoon out of the air. And then walked around and gave each of us a spoon of the amrit. Then, when I got back to the United States with the crucifix, Mrs. Cowan, you know who Mrs. Cowan is? Mrs. Cowan, an old-time devotee, she's dead now. She had the first Satya Sai bookstore in Tustin, California, and used to go there all the time with Mr. Cowan. Maybe I'll have time later on to tell you the story, or maybe this afternoon, the story of the resurrection of Mr. Cowan. And so Mrs. Cowan wanted pictures of the crucifix to add to her inventory in the store. And so I said, well, it would have to be with Swami's permission. So somehow she got Swami's permission. And so a professional photographer who was a devotee, we were living in Mexico, my wife and I. In fact, that is our home for the last 20 years in Mexico. We lived in a big house on a hill overlooking the ocean and the islands out in the ocean, and behind us are the mountains of Mexico, beautiful place. And so he took the photographs, and then he came back a couple of weeks later with the pictures. He did the pictures. We were all sitting around the table admiring the pictures. Now it was a clear Mexican sky, not a cloud in the sky, just completely still. And suddenly, as we were staring at the pictures and thinking of Swami, there was a sudden burst of thunder, a loud burst of thunder, and a big wind came. We have big French windows to look out on the ocean. Blew open the French windows and banged the doors and blew all the curtains in the house back and forth. And so everybody was puzzled. And they said, what is that? How could that be? And then my wife said, oh, it's in the Bible. So then she went and got the Bible and found the appropriate passage where the winds had come into the temple and had rent the curtains of the temple. And so then another time a chap came down from Northern California and wanted to see the crucifix. So we showed him the crucifix. And as we were showing him the crucifix, there was like an earthquake, the whole house shook. And so then Fanabanda wanted to put the crucifix in his book, A Vision of Divinity, I think it's called. And so I wrote him the story about the crucifix, how we'd had this tremendous wind blowing the doors and renting the curtains of the house, and how there'd been an earthquake and the other chap was looking at it. And whenever Swami goes to Bombay, he usually stops at the house of Fanabanda and visits Fanabanda and his wife and their two children. And this time, there happened to be laying beside Fanabanda's typewriter, he was working on his book, this letter that I had written, Fanabanda. And Swami picked it up and read it. And Fanabanda asked him, well, Swami, is that correct? And Swami said, oh yes, that's correct. That's correct. That's exactly what happened. It was the recapitulation of the death of Christ. And then I went down, they asked me to go down to Latin America, to El Salvador. to talk to the people there. And at the home of the ghost, or the host rather, not the ghost, the Holy Ghost was about to come, so that's why I got that mixed up. And all the Salvadorian people were in this great big house of the head devotee, and the crucifix, I'd taken it down, was on the table. And suddenly, it was a bright, shiny day there, suddenly a tremendous thunder, and it poured rain, and the wind blew open his windows. Same thing happened exactly as it did in our house in Mexico. So it's a very powerful thing, that crucifix. I'm sorry I couldn't bring it to show it to you, but it's so fragile that I'm afraid to carry it around. So those were the two stories I was asked to tell before I started to talk. So those who asked me, I've done that. Now, about Swami, the Shankaracharya of Kanchi. You know who Shankara is. All Indians know who Shankara is. Charya means teacher, Shankaracharya. And Shankara established some temples at the cardinal points of India. And Kanchi is one such point. And so the Shankaracharya there is a very eminent person, great yogi, a great spiritual person. And he said, speaking of the avatar, he said that when there is a person whose conduct and life is filled with goodness, and his heart is filled with compassion and tranquility, the instant they set eyes on him, people trust him. And they adopt his teachings because they feel sure the doctrine set forth by such a man cannot be other than sound. So we find Swami to be like that. His life and his conduct filled with goodness, his heart filled with compassion and tranquility. And so the minute we set eyes on Swami, we have that trust in Swami, and we take his teachings to heart and practice his teachings because we think that doctrine set forth by Swami, such a man, must be sound and must be correct. So there's Swami in our life, and then there's ourselves here. Who are we? In one of his talks, Swami said that if you take a regular worldly person and he's willing to listen to you, and you very carefully explain the cardinal points of the Vedanta Advaita philosophy to that person, and he gives you close attention, he won't understand a word of what you said. And so, how about us then? Why are we here? What brings us here? Has to be something from the long distant past. Each person here, I'm sure, has a long, long history of spiritual life, spiritual search, and perhaps even close association with embodiments of God in the distant past. That is ourselves. So why then, what's our interest? Why are we here? Our interest is liberation, is it not? We want liberation. We want self-realization. That's why we're here. That's what we want. That appeals to us. That has meaning to us. It reverberates down the corridors of time in the distant past. And what are the obstacles then? Why aren't we all self-realized to our knowledge right now? According to Swami, the obstacles are jealousy, anger, hatred, and the full range of human faults. Those are the things that are the obstacles that prevent us from achieving self-realization here and now. So, where can we turn for help? We want liberation, but somehow we feel we're not liberated. So where can we turn for help? We can turn to Swami for help. Swami will help us. There's no doubt of it. Swami will help us. Well, where is Swami? How can we get in touch with Swami to help us? He's so busy. We go to Prasanthi Nilayam, we can just see him in the distance. Can't catch him and talk to him and ask him a lot of questions. So where is Swami? Well, Swami is here right beside us. We can ask him in our hearts, in our conscience. And I'll tell you the story of the McDowalls to illustrate how he is always, always here. The McDowalls, there's the father and the son and the mother. I think the mother has now passed away. They lived on a small farm in Kentucky, several miles away from the nearest town. And their custom every day was to, in the afternoon, go in the house and shut the door, and they would meditate for a couple hours. And they also had on this farm a dog, which had been with them for a long time, and of which they were very, very fond. Well, one day, as dogs do, this dog simply disappeared. Must have been killed somehow or other. He was gone. Then the next day, or a couple of days later, a dog came on the grounds of the farm. And he came up to them and started to bark and jump up at them and lick their hand. So they thought, the mother and the father and the son, well, here's another dog, let us adopt him. So they adopted that dog. Now came the time for their afternoon meditation. And they couldn't have the dog running around barking while they were meditating. So the father, Mr. McDowall, took this new dog and put him in the garage. Now the garage had two doors. The door of the car goes in, and the door the passengers walk out of, like most garages do. So Mr. McDowall put the dog in the garage and locked both doors so the dog couldn't get out. So then they did their meditation, and they came out, and there was the dog at the foot of the stairs, the veranda stairs, barking. And Mrs. McDowall and the son went on down, but Mr. McDowall, who really wasn't yet a devotee, you know, the ladies come first, and if they're lucky, the men folk sometimes follow. That was the case with the McDowalls. So Mr. McDowall started down the steps, and he had a balustrade, a railing on the porch, and so he stopped halfway down and put his head in his hands like that and was looking at the dog, wondering. And then sort of a sotto voice to himself, but the others could hear him. He said, "It's got to be Swami." So they didn't pay any attention to him. After all, that's just Father. Why should they pay attention to Father? So then, that was a small incident, completely forgotten. 3 years later, they came on their first visit to see Swami. And my wife and I happened to be there at that same time. And when the McDowalls were called in for interview, my wife and I were called in the same group of people. Now, those of you who have been in interview with Swami, you know his custom. That is, he will speak to almost everybody. He'll ask an innocent question like, where do you come from? As though he didn't know. And are you married? And what's your wife's name? Although she's sitting right there. And anything to just sort of put the people at ease and suppress the tension that everybody has when they go in to see Swami. And so he went around the room talking to everybody, one by one, and then he came to the McDowalls who were sitting. First he had stopped. The people just before the McDowalls were 3 Indian ladies. And in speaking to them, he had bent down and said something to them quietly that other people couldn't hear. Then he came to the McDowalls. Well, Mrs. McDowall, as a lady, doesn't miss things like that. And so it occurred to her, I bet he said something about us. And so when the meeting was over, Mrs. McDowall went up to these 3 Indian ladies, followed them out, and said, would you mind telling me what Swami said to you? And they said, no, we don't mind. He said, they think I'm a dog. Mind you, 3 years later, 3 years after the event, and such a minor, unimportant event, yet Swami knew exactly and even didn't forget, remembered. So therefore, when we ask who will help us, we can say that Swami will help us. And where is Swami? Swami is here with us at all times. Now, the core question that faces all devotees, as you have read and heard for so many years, I'm sure, is the question, who am I? Who am I? That is the core question in human society. Who am I? And so, how are we going to start to approach that question? What should we do to look into that question and find out the actual answer to it? Because Swami has said, until you can answer that question, who am I, you really won't make any genuine progress in spiritual life. So then we have to ask, how do we approach that question? What does it mean? What do we do with those words? So, since Swami is there to help us, we turn to Swami and ask him how to go about the answering the question, who am I? Now, Swami answers by saying that to find out the answer to that question, who am I, there are 2 principal spiritual paths. One path is the path of devotion, and the other path is the path of wisdom. Now, he likens the path of devotion to the kitten and the mother cat. The mother cat, when she moves someplace, doesn't leave the kitten behind. She picks up the kitten and she carries the kitten wherever she goes. Therefore, the kitten has nothing to worry about. He just relies on mother, and mother does everything for that kitten. And the path of wisdom, then, is likened to the small monkey and its mother. Now, when mother moves, if the little monkey doesn't want to be left behind, what does it have to do? It has to exert its own energy and its own strength and jump on mother's back and hang on for dear life. Is that right? Has to use your own energy, your own resolve, in order to not get left behind. So Swami likens that to the path of wisdom. Now, this morning, I think we should tackle the path of wisdom, and this afternoon, the path of devotion. Why the path of wisdom? Because in this world, this Western world, we're accustomed to understanding things. We want to inquire and to understand what we're going to do and why we're going to do it before we jump into the situation and engage in action. That's our way here, our custom here. And so that's probably the place we should start, with the path of wisdom. Now, this inquiry as to who am I, we're going to start, leads to questions. That is, you start to ask questions of people. The people you know who are supposed to know things. Perhaps the pastor of the church, perhaps the priest, perhaps gurus. You start to ask questions. And if the answers are not satisfactory, then you have to put aside the answers that you hear from others and start a search. That search for the answer to, who am I? And that was really my story. As a young lad, I belonged to the Episcopal Church with my parents. And you know how it is with all preachers. They don't want the young people to leave the church. They want the young people to stay in the church. And so in the Episcopal Church, and it must be the case with other churches too, they would have plays for the young people. The young people in the church would put on a play. And the fathers and mothers would come and they would see the play. And the whole thing would take place in the church. Well, I was in such a play. And suddenly the thought struck me with devastating force. These church people don't know what they're talking about. So, but someplace in the world, there has to be somebody who knows what they're talking about and can show to me that they know what they're talking about when they describe what should be the goal of a man's life. What should he do in this life? So at that early age, I knew what my future was. I knew the path that my life would take. And it would be to search the world to find somebody who could tell me in a way that I could see what I should do with my life, what people should do with their life. So I embarked on a long, long search and encountered many yogis and accomplished people. One of the first really was, ever heard of J. Krishnamurti and Dr. Annie Besant? Dr. Annie Besant, the president of the Theosophical Society, and J. Krishnamurti, the world teacher. And so very early on then, in 1924, I was at Arya-Vihara with Krishnamurti and Dr. Besant. I lived there with them and worked there. Every morning I would go into Dr. Besant's room, or ante-room, and start a fire in the fireplace so her place would be warm when she got up and so on. And I traveled then all over the world to J. Krishnamurti camps, listening to Krishnamurti. And then I encountered, after encountering the Yogananda, you know Yogananda? He's written a famous book. And I talked to Yogananda many times. And we used to come in from Riverside every Sunday to go to Yogananda's place. And he would have some lad on the stage who was the accomplished Hatha yogi. And he would go through all the postures of Hatha yoga. And then Yogananda would talk. And he asked me one time, would you like to be my disciple? And I said, I wasn't sure, so I said, no, thank you, no. And then I found out later on why I didn't want to be a disciple of Yogananda, although I didn't appreciate it at the time, when I met the white yogi from Russia, who was buried under a baseball field in Inglewood, California. You know where Inglewood is. For several days, buried, all covered up. And then they uncovered him. He came out fine and dandy. No air, no food, no nothing, no water. He survived without any trouble at all. He was they called him the White Russian Yogi. He'd learned those tricks up in the Himalayas mountains. Then another trick he had was he'd be on the stage, and they would have two platforms. And he would have his head on one and his heels on the other. And under his head would be under his neck, a sharp blade. And under the tendons of his heels where he was resting would be a sharp blade. And then he would go into a trance, just as stiff as a board, like that. Then they would put a block of cement on his stomach and take a sledgehammer and bam, break the block of cement. And then he would come to and get up, and despite the razor-sharp blade on his neck and his ankles, no mark at all. So he used to travel with Yogananda when Yogananda was doing lectures here and there. And every day after the lectures, they would have their dinner up in the hotel room. And Yogananda's dinner would be 3 or 4 big hamburgers, although he was preaching vegetarianism. So that failure to carry out in practice what was said, I suppose, was what I felt and turned me off from Yogananda, although he's a very, very nice man. Then you've heard of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi with his TM meditation. Well, I met him when he first came to Hollywood. Then I became the first president of the TM Society and also the first initiator of people into the TM meditation for going on 2 years. Then I made a discovery that turned me off from that too. But during the time that I was with Mahesh Yogi, I went to India, way up in the Himalayas. Do you know a place called Uttarkashi? You chaps from India? The Valley of the Saints, way up, about 60 miles from the Tibetan border. Uttarkashi, the Valley of the Saints. And so Maharishi wanted an academy established there to train meditation teachers. So I went up there and found a place. That's a long story. I won't tell it now, because we must get on with our path of wisdom. Now, this search that we engage in when we enter the path of wisdom, the search for who am I, we aren't the first generation to engage in that search. That search for the answer to who am I is as old as man himself is. It has its rise from 3 fundamental desires that are the human desires. One is to know everything without end. We're always inquisitive. We want to know. We want to investigate. We want to know. The second desire is that we want to be happy. And we don't want anything to interfere with that happiness. We want to be perfectly happy all the time, without end. And then the second one is that we don't want it to end. We want to keep on being happy, 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 happy. That is, longing for immortality. So those 3 basic desires are entertained by every person in the world, if not so consciously, at least unconsciously, and it motivates their behavior, as you can easily see if you understand what's going on and see what people do. Right now, if we're going to make the inquiry then, what is the path of wisdom? Those two paths, we've chosen that one to look into. How do we go about that? Probably the best way at first would be to find out what does Swami and what do the sages of old say about the path of wisdom. What is their advice? What have they found out about it? And then we can see what we ourselves should do to put it into practice. So we can look at and ask of the sages of recent times, and who are these? Who are those? Yogananda Paramahansa, Maharishi, Ramana Maharshi. You recognize all these names, Ramana Maharshi, and Nisargata Maharaj of Bombay. We can look into them. We can go back a few years and inquire about what Arjuna and Krishnaji said together. Or we can go back some thousands of years and find out what sage Vashishta said to Sri Rama, the avatar Sri Rama. So we read and look at what these people have said, and we read and look at what Swami has said, and you will, I'm sure, and probably have, come to the same conclusion as myself, and that is that the one thing that they all emphasize as being absolutely vital on the path of wisdom is detachment. Detachment. And what does the word detachment mean? It means to be in terms of self-inquiry, it means to be disconnected from, to look at without being affected, to be the witness of. So it means to be the witness of happenings without being involved in the happenings. Like we stand here and we see two men quarreling. Well, we don't engage in the quarrel at all. We step aside and we're simply the witness to that quarrel, the unaffected witness. Now, what does detachment mean then as applied to ourselves? For example, Hislop might get angry at somebody. Somebody does something. For example, it always makes me a bit angry in Chula Vista where I live to be driving and the signal light changes and some yo-ho will zoom right through that red light after the red light is turned on. You know, not only endangering his life, which he's welcome to destroy, that's his business, but how about all the other innocent people that he can kill in just a second? So I feel angry about that. That soon gets over, but nevertheless I do feel anger. Well then, who is the witness of that anger? Somebody has to be detached and observe that. It can't be my consciousness, which is the observer, because my consciousness has been moderated, involved, changed by the happening. So I'm aware of that, what's happened, but it can't be the consciousness who is the witness because the consciousness is involved. But nevertheless, somehow or other, I know it happened. So to find out then who knows what happened without being involved means moving inside, inside, inside. For example, I know it happened entirely apart from my consciousness, which was affected by the happening, and also I know it happened. So who knows that I knew it happened? So you look at that and then see if there's some awareness behind that. It's called in Vedanta, what's it called? Neti, neti, neti. Not that, not that, not that. So everything is looked at, and if it can be looked at and put aside, neti, not that, that's not me, it changes, it can't be me, so you move back. Move backward, 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 until nothing can be put aside, and you've reached the final realization. Now, how is that then applied to oneself? For example, here's Hislop. Now, Hislop is accustomed to being the observer. That is, I observe the world and what's happening in the world, so I'll reach common sense conclusions about what's happening and know what I should do. So I'm accustomed to being the observer. And the seen, then, I am the seer. And whatever is happening in the world, is the seen. I am the observer, that is the observed. I am the seer, that is the seen. That's been my custom all my life. Now I hear about self-inquiry. And what does that then mean? That means that Hislop, who has been the observer, who has been the seer, now becomes the object to be observed. As this person Hislop, instead of continuing on his old path of being the observer of everything that happens and drawing conclusions and acting on those conclusions, now he is on the table as a specimen to be examined. Now there has to be a watching of Hislop. What makes Hislop tick? Hislop, for example, Hislop thinks that he is the body, and therefore gets involved in everything that involves the body. My gosh, here's almost 11 o'clock and I haven't said anything yet. What should I do? Well, go ahead for another 5 minutes. Another 10 minutes. Okay. So you see that is, Hislop must now be observed. Well, who is going to be this observer of Hislop? The observer of Hislop is that awareness which is superior to that which is being observed at the moment. Then you observe that awareness and find what's behind it. All right? Then, let me tell you then what Swami says about the world and the universe. That will shock you. There's Hislop and then there's the world. What about the world that we are looking at? All this world that we've been observing. Swami tells us that it is like a mirage. A mirage, the water in a mirage doesn't come from any place, nor does it go any place. In like fashion, this world does not come out of the absolute, nor does it go anyplace. It's like a dream, something passing that we shouldn't get so excited about. That's the world, unreal, like a dream. We could talk about that for some time. But now what does it mean? Here's something that people get vastly confused about when they hear, as you've heard so many times, that the world is a dream, it's unreal. It doesn't mean that the world doesn't exist as such. It's just that the world is constantly changing. You can't look at anything and say that's the truth, because the next second has changed. And the truth is that which is the same before, during, and after any time period. Never changes. So you can't say that about anything whatsoever that's in the world. Constantly changing. So therefore it's called non-existent for that reason, although certainly it exists, but ever changing. So what we're looking for is that which never changes, the eternal. And so then, how may one go about that by himself? I'll tell you what happens to me. Now, for example, I'm here now talking to you, engaged in action. Now, it's obvious to me that as long as I'm engaged in this action, I must pay attention to the action. Otherwise, I say stupid things and it doesn't make any sense. I have to pay attention to what I'm doing. Therefore, if I want to look beyond what I'm doing, I have to find a place and a time when I can be quiet and not involved in action. And when my mind is not involved, it's free. So therefore, I choose a quiet time. Swami says a good quiet time can be found by sitting quietly and letting the breath come slower and slower and slower and slower, as it will, until it's very, very slow. Then everything is slowed down and the mind is calm and you can look at things. Now, when one starts to do that, you realize that whether you're engaged in action or whether you're sitting quietly, the feeling I am is there. You know it directly, that I am. You don't have to get up and check yourself in a mirror to make sure that you are. You know it directly, I am. So therefore, you start to look into this business of I am and go deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, for myself, going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, I come to a point where there is awareness, but there is no one who is aware. I can't go beyond it. No one who is aware. There's just a vast field of awareness without any center. No center of the awareness, just a vast field of awareness without a center of observation or knowing awareness, or without any boundaries, no perimeters whatsoever. Then I realize it's always been like that. I cast my memory back to my memory of myself at my earliest childhood, and I realize that in terms of what I am now in this awareness, I haven't changed one iota from my earliest memory of childhood. I'm exactly the same. I'm the same before an experience, during the experience, and after the experience. No change whatsoever. Then I look at Hislop, and it's like I'm standing, let us say, in a third-story window of a house looking down at the street. And there are the people and the commerce of the world going back and forth on the street. And I'm not affected at all because I'm way up high, totally separated, just observing. And then I see Hislop. Where's Hislop? There's Hislop on the street walking with the others. And I see no difference between Hislop and the others walking on the street. So in that very, very quiet area of awareness, then I can start to look at and see what is meant by I am. And to that point at least, I find what I am is pure awareness. Now, then that's when I'm quiet. How about when I'm involved in activity then? What's the situation there? The situation there is that occasionally I forget to be the observer and get involved. But then I quickly recollect myself and realize that nothing that happens is touching me. I'm completely separate and have nothing to do with what's happening outside. I am awareness within, just awareness of everything that happens. Now, is that liberation? Absolutely it is not, because nothing has to be done to gain liberation. It can't be gained. Liberation is eternal, ever present. If it were not eternal, what's the use of searching it? What can be found can come to an end. And we are assured by Swami and the great sages of all ages that liberation is eternal, that we are liberated now, this very moment. And what is the chief reason that we do not know that we are liberated? What's the chief reason bringing about this ignorance of our true nature? It is the idea that we are a separate unit, a separate person, unique and separate from God. That we are separate from God. we are unique individuals. What did Jesus say? I am the Son, I am the Father, he who sees me sees the Father. So, if you wish to tackle the question of who am I, and if you wish to do as the ancient sages say, and the Swami says if you read carefully, you must start to detach yourself. The first detachment is the idea that you're the body, which is a completely false idea. Your relationship to the body, my relationship to this body, is like my relationship to my shadow. What does the height and the color and the career of my shadow matter to me? I walk, my shadow goes through mud and rubbish, or it goes across the flower bed. What does it matter to me? It's my shadow, it's there, but I am not the shadow. I'm just a witness of the shadow. The body to us is like the shadow is to ourselves as we now think ourselves to be. Just like a shadow to ourselves as the reality, as the observer. Now we could go on, there's lots of other things to say, but I've taken your patience for 10 minutes beyond time. So we'll talk this afternoon then about the path of devotion. Thank you for listening.